Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
And we're here for another look at Norse mythology. This is our final look at Norse mythology because there's not much more to say after this episode, because this is about Ragnarok.
Say it's not so.
Yeah, it's the twilight of the gods time, or Götterdämmerung if you speak German.
Oh, can't
Yes.
say that I do, but that sounds interesting.
If this episode had a soundtrack, it would be Ride of the Valkyries by Richard Wagner,
Oh,
because a lot of Wagner's stuff is based on Norse mythology.
okay.
So we've already discussed how Balder died and how Loki was captured and bound to the entrails of his own son in a really horrific scene. Now, like a lot of mythology, time is very fluid for the gods. There are some versions of the story where the death of Balder and the binding of Loki immediately lead to Ragnarok. And there's some of them which there's a space in between. And there's even a way of translating the story that so much time passes that the gods actually go to sleep. And they take this power nap to recharge their energy. A gimmick Marvel Comics has actually used. They call it the Odin sleep, where if it's necessary for plot purposes, Odin just goes into a coma for a certain amount of time and comes out stronger at the end.
I'm going to refer to all of my naps from this point forward.
So this is an apocalyptic story, and it may sound familiar. Several religions, including the Judeo-Christian one, have an apocalypse, at their end. This was written down around 1000 AD. It is probably much older than that. It certainly feels much more like a pagan story than one that's been Christianized, but at the same time, there are obvious parallels between this and the Book of Revelations. By 1000 AD, Christianity had reached the Vikings, but it hadn't fully converted them yet. So they could well have been aware, and that it could have tainted the way it was written down. Mm-hmm. By 1100, 100 years after this was written down, all the Vikings were Christianized, and that was the end of the Viking world, because you're not supposed to attack a fellow Christian, and once the Vikings converted, well, all of Europe was Christians. There's literally no one left for them to attack. So they had to kind of give up their Viking ways and settle down and just become farmers. And like I said, the Norsemen were only partly converted when this was written down. So if you assume the loss of their pagan religion was the end of their culture, then he's writing about destruction during a time when their culture was being destroyed.
Interesting.
It's one interpretation. There are some mythologists who believe that this is a strongly Christian influenced story, and others who say that it's really not. It has no more than a thin veneer that was added to it. It's based on the Völuspá, as translated by Snorri Sturluson and a lot of Neil Gaiman.
Okay.
Who does, as always, one of the best versions of it. I will tell you of dark days and hidden things. It will be an axe age, a sword age. There will be a wind age and a wolf age before the world is wrecked. Midgard will be racked by war, earth. Fathers will slaughter sons, brothers will be drenched in each other's blood. And it goes on like that for another paragraph or two. Mothers are killing their daughters, and daughters are sleeping with their brothers, and so forth.
Yeah, I see some parallels.
Yep. These are the signs that the world will end. The first definite sign is Fimbulvert. Fimbulvert is the winter to end all winters. It is when the snow starts to fall and doesn't stop for 3 years.
Oh.
So all the crops die, the cattle die, mankind wars for the limited resources, struggling to survive as they're gradually wiped out, and the sun turns black, which doesn't help anything either. In some versions, the sun and the moon are eaten by two different giant wolves. Now, Jormungard. Jormungard is the world serpent. He's Thor's old nemesis. He is a snake so large, he literally wraps around the entire planet Earth. He will start to stir. And when a snake that big starts to wriggle around, it causes earthquakes, tidal waves, massive destruction everywhere. While the earth is shaking, Fenris the Wolf, remember the one that bit off Tyr's hand? Mm-hmm. Well, he's been chained up, but it's prophesied he'll be released at the end of days. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, Fenris is able to snap his bonds and become free. And as he does, he grows like larger and larger and more dangerous, with all the hunger and violence that's been tied up for so long is unleashed. And at the same time, in the earthquake, Loki, who's lying in a cave on Midgard, will burst free from his bonds. Loki has no mischief in him anymore. His time watching his children be slaughtered, being tied up with a snake dripping poison on his face, all that's driven his sense of humor right out of him. When he comes out of the cave, he's in full-blown supervillain mode. There's nothing left for him to do except what was prophesized.
Yep.
So along with the earthquakes and everything, Naglfar. Now Naglfar is the ship made from dead man's fingers and toenails. So all the people that drowned, sailors and Vikings, always like trim off their fingernails and their toenails before they go to sea. Because when you drown, your fingernails and toenails go to create this like magic ship, Naglfar, which will sail at the end of the world, bringing the dead to Midgard. So if you want to kind of push back Ragnarok a little bit further, always make sure to trim your nails before you go to sea. Very important. Vikings always had very trim fingernails because of that.
All right.
You never knew. When the ship sails, it'll contain the unrighteous dead. All the ones that died badly. Cowards and thieves who had no honor. And their legions will be commanded by Loki. His daughter Hela will throw open the gates of hell and release all these souls. And Loki will command them. And he'll sail towards Asgard with Naglfar. So, all this does not escape Heimdall. Now in Asgard, Heimdall is the guardian of the gods. He literally stands at the gate. He guards the Bifrost. And with his vision, he can see across the whole of the earth. He sees everything. And he sees this happening. Again, he probably should have seen it 3 years ago when the endless winter arrived. But again, like I said, time is fluid for the gods. So he sees that everything is happening as it was preordained. He lifts up his great sword, Hofund, and he sounds at the Gjallarhorn. And the Gjallarhorn is the great horn that will blow, that will tell the gods that Ragnarok is nigh. That's the signal the living and the dead have all been waiting for. The gods will stir to battle. They will grab their armor. They will grab their weapons. In Valhalla, the Einherjar dwell. The Einherjar, or probably I shouldn't pronounce the J, and Heiner, they are the righteous dead, the ones that Odin took to Valhalla. And they had been training every day, fighting endless battles against each other, getting better and better with their swords and their shields and their spears. And at the end of the day in Valhalla, each of them, the dead, rises up again, and they go back and have a big feast together, and they go out the next morning and do it again. So these guys have literally been hardcore training for hundreds of years. And now is their time. They hear the sound of the Gjallarhorn. And they know it's time to grab their horses and ride out of Valhalla for Asgard. This is the day that they have been training for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And Odin is there to lead them. He has shining golden armor, and he's riding on the back of Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, and he's got the spear Gungnir in his hand that never misses when it strikes. So the ship of the dead docks, and the righteous dead from Asgard pour down to meet them. A furious battle ensues as the dead men fight. And this time when they fall, they do not rise again. This time death is permanent. But with heaven and hell in their world are empty at this point. There's nowhere for the dead to go. The Fenris Wolf is there, bigger and more dangerous than ever. And Jormungard, the great world serpent, is like sliding towards Asgard with poison dripping from his enormous fangs that are longer than a man. The frost giants are led by Hymir. They still remember how Odin killed their leader back when the world was being created. They've been itching for revenge ever since. And when the frost giants walk towards Asgard, everything they pass is left a frozen wasteland. And from Muspelheim, the fire giants arrive. They're led by Surtur, the fire giant, with his sword made of flame. And they leave behind them nothing but lava and volcanic ash. So all these troops, everybody is gathering. One writer said, think of every horrible monster you can imagine, and that's what the gods are fighting against. This is the final battle. Odin and the Fenris Wolf engage first. He drives Sleipnir, who runs like the wind, towards Fenris, moves ahead of everybody else, and starts slashing with his spear. And the spear never misses, but the Fenris Wolf is so large at that point. He cuts it, but he can't reach a killing blow. There's blood gushing everywhere, but the wolf keeps twisting around and snapping at him. So as they fight, Frey goes after Surt, as it was ordained that he would do. But Frey has lost his magic sword that could protect him from the fire. He gave it up in last week's adventure. So now he has a good sword, mind you, probably a magic sword, but it's no match for Surt. Surt cuts through the sword, it melts like butter. And Frey is among the first to die, his body burned to ashes by the sword. So Thor sees his old enemy, Jormungard, the world serpent, looming up over the battle with his huge mouth, and immediately leaps right at him. This is what he was born to do. He flies over him and brings down Mjolnir on his head, and with a single blow crashes his skull, destroying his brain. And then he falls off and crashes down to the ground. And above him, the great serpent is swaying, and his mouth opens, and poison gushes from its fangs that rain down on Thor. And he feels the poison seeping into his pores. And he staggers to get out of the way of the serpent as it falls down. And he takes one painful step at a time, and with each beating of his heart, he can feel the poison pumping through his body. He walks exactly 9 steps, and he falls to the ground dead. And Thor is no more. Meanwhile, Odin's fight is not going any better. He's slashing away at Fenris, but hasn't even been able to hurt him. And finally, the great wolf opens its giant jaws, and he engulfs Odin and swallows him in one bite. And Odin goes down fighting, but it's all over. That's how powerful the Fenris Wolf is. But Odin's son Vidar sees this happen. Now, Vidar has magic boots. This is very important. In those days, you got boots that were kind of like ill-fitting lumps of leather, and you shaved leather off of them until it fits your foot. Now, if you ever have a chance to do that, just throw away the leather scraps that are left over whenever you do any kind of project like that, because all the leather scraps are discarded go to Vidar. And Vidar is made a boot made of all the leather that everybody on Earth has cast away over the years. So he has basically a giant leather boot. And he jumps into Fenris Wolf's mouth, and the boot is strong enough and thick enough to protect him from the razor-sharp fangs. And so inside the mouth, he balances on the fangs and lifts up with his arms, as all of his strength, and he forces the jaws open until it cracks. And with his jaw broken, he has no defense, and Vidar is able to kill the Fenris Wolf. It's the only thing that could destroy him.
But by this time, Odin and Thor are
already gone. The big guns are already taken out of the battle. Meanwhile, the dead are dying right and left. The righteous dead, the unrighteous dead are cutting each other to pieces. They seem pretty evenly matched.
Okay.
So in the middle of all this, there's this moment of quiet, I imagine, across the battlefield. One writer describes it as being, they walked across corpses to approach each other.
Yeah.
Loki and Heimdall lock eyes. And so they're coming at each other now. Loki has his magic sword, Heimdall has Halfrund, and they start to battle. And they're both really good, really talented. They hack away at each other while more and more of the bodies are piling up around them. And then suddenly they both strike fatal blows. They kill each other in battle and stagger away. And as they're dying, Loki laughs and says, "You see, I won after all." And Heimdall says, "No, I can see further than you, Loki. I see new worlds being born, because nothing ever truly ends." Loki probably had some really witty and cutting remark to say, but at that point he bled out and died. And then Heimdall died right after him. So meanwhile, with the last of the named Norse gods who have personalities gone, Surtur the fire giant sees his moment of glory, and Surtur waves his flaming sword in the air and sets fire to Asgard. And then as that burns, the rest of the 9 worlds burn as well, and flames shoot across Yggdrasil, the world tree. The whole world burns.
Okay. You mean the universe?
The whole universe, yes, the whole universe burns. But it also, when that's done, it sinks into the water.
Okay.
Where the water came from, I don't know. It sinks into the water, which puts out the fire. And the earth, the whole universe bobs back to the surface again. And strangely, some things have survived. For one thing, Yggdrasil is a very strong tree. It's the largest tree in the universe. Now, as you may know, in some forest fires are really good for trees.
Yes.
It burns out a lot of the brush, and the trees that remain become stronger.
It's necessary, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yggdrasil could not be destroyed by Surt's fire.
Right.
And even though they believed that all of mankind had been wiped out, in fact, there were 2 people left. They'd hidden in a notch in Yggdrasil and pressed themselves into the wood to protect them from the fire. They were a man and a woman. The woman was called Life, and the man was called Life's Yearning. And they come down to a new world, where everything is being born again. Now, a handful of the gods survived. And interestingly, they're all the gods that you've never heard of, basically. Like I said, all the named gods die heroically. Odin's sons, Vidar and Vali, both survive. They managed to make it out alive, probably clinging to Yggdrasil. And Magni and Modi, Thor's sons, also survive. It takes both of them to carry their father's hammer, but they're still young. And Balder comes back because, well, like I said, heaven and hell are empty at this point, so there's nothing stopping him from coming back to Asgard. So Balder is reborn. And so while mankind is busy repopulating the earth and learning how to plant crops and grow cattle all over again, the gods sit down in this big field and they discuss, maybe we should have done things differently. What could we have done that would have changed things? And it's probably a deeply philosophical conversation. And as they're talking, one of the gods looks down and he sees something lying in the tall grass. And it's a chess piece. Now, quite likely in the original Volpsa, it was not a chess piece. It was a piece from another game that Vikings played. But we call it a chess piece because every single person who translated it used the word chess. So he finds a gaming piece in the grass, and he picks it up, and it's made of gold. And the figure looks exactly like Odin. And as they search around the grass, they find more figures. They find Odin is like the king, and Frigga is the queen, and they find more and more of these pieces. And then they find other pieces made of silver. There's a piece of Loki and his daughter Hela as the king and queen. And there's the Fenris Wolf and Jormungard. And then they find a whole chessboard of precious metal. And they lay it out, and one by one they put the pieces on the board again, and they sit down there. They discuss it for a very long time. And then finally one of Odin's sons reaches down and touches a piece and moves it across the board. And the game begins again. Because every ending is also a beginning.
Yeah.
Now, whether this is a story that happened a long time ago or happens in days that are yet to be, I'll leave up to you to decide.
Right. Right.
Because it's your call.
And I would guess that's also why the gods didn't have names. Because the people who were coming were going to make new stories.
Yeah. Jack Kirby, who first told the stories of Thor in Marvel Comics, had a famous falling out with his partner Stan Lee. He went to another company and started creating characters for them. He literally created a comic book called New Gods. And in the first issue of New Gods, Orion and Lightray stumble across the ruins of an ancient civilization. And while digging around, Orion picks up an old battered helmet that looks exactly like the winged helmet that Thor wears in the comic book.
Wow.
So Jack Kirby himself passed the torch from one generation of gods to another as he traveled from one comic book company to another.
Very cool.
Because every ending is also a beginning.
Right.
That's how the world will end, or has ended.
You're a very good storyteller.
Thank you. It's one of my favorite stories.
I love it too.
I was 10 or 11 when I first read a version of that. And yeah, it's impossible to read that without being moved.
Yeah.
even though the Norse gods were jerks, in most of their stories. But they have this doom hanging over them that colors everything they say and do.
Right. And it's very relatable.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
All right, so until next time, this has been Conversations. I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
I'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.